Good evening, it's Sunday the 28th of June 2020 and this is the Rebel Transmission Weekly Show with me, your host, Ben Somerville. We start tonight by talking about this man, Prime Minister of the United Kingdoms of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson. Today marks only the fifth day since the 16th of March that has not had a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet or, on rare occasions, the actual Prime Minister holding a daily press briefing regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. The decision to stop these briefings has supposedly come from Boris Johnson himself on the basis of following the science. We assume that at least this much is true, that Boris did indeed himself take that decision. The alternative is that he was instructed to do so by notorious Tory puppet master, retrospective changer of published works and erstwhile short-sighted driver Dominic Cummings. But that couldn't possibly be the case though, no. It definitely 100% was a decision taken by the elected official and not at all the shadowy background figure as a publicity move. Yes, definitely. At the same time as announcing that Tuesday's briefing would be the final daily briefing of the pandemic, and thereby effectively ringing his bell loudly and shouting 6 o'clock and all is well, the PM made sure to hammer the point home by removing the 2-metre rule for Britons in public and reopening the pubs from the 4th of July. This was, again, a move that claims to follow the science. The problem is that that phrase, the science, is hollow and has been thrown around with such gleeful abandon that it's lost all meaning. No actual scientists are named when talking about the science. Very few, if any, actual figures are ever quoted by the government, and when they aren't ever anchored to a reference that necessarily makes sense in the context of what's being said to the people watching. And as we shall talk about later, some things that come out of this government are simply false. At this stage, the science may as well be the name of the rabbit that Magician Johnson pulls out of his hat whenever his other tricks fall short. Secretary of State for Health Matt Hancock, his reluctant albeit earnest Debbie McGee. Were one of a cynical disposition, it might almost seem that the cancellation of these daily briefings and the eagerly awaited opening of pubs were opportunities taken simply to stop the government from being asked any further awkward questions about its handling of the coronavirus pandemic. Our birthday party magician now showing his street card magic savvy with a classic switcheroo by helping us swap cheap, private, home alcoholism for public, expensive but sociable alcoholism with a deft sleight of hand. On which note, come the 4th of July, I sincerely hope that any bartenders working in the UK are prepared to hear, "Did you actually put any booze in this, mate?" about 1,000 times a night. We've all become dangerously used to the just a bit more free pour techniques of our own homes. I know I have. The problem with all of this trickery and subterfuge, I obviously mean carefully thought out transition back to normal existence, is that it brings us from one extraordinary situation to another. Whilst people are in their own homes full time, confronted by the prospect that should they leave, they might genuinely die, it is very easy to control the narrative of the day. The government has bent over backwards and tied themselves in literal knots trying to ensure that people stay with their message during the pandemic. That was during the easy period, with a cowed population. Now, they have grown accustomed to controlling the dialogue at all times, and unfortunately, they can't anymore, at least not with such ease. We are confronted with a world that's fast catching back up to them, standing in front of the cameras last week, telling us that Brexit is all going to be okay because we will finally have access to a slightly superior style of penguin biscuit in the shape of reasonably priced Tim Tams from Australia and New Zealand, is not putting anyone's mind at ease, although in fairness to him, Tim Tams are better. That said, we already make biscuits. I can buy them right now over here and generally fairly reasonably priced. We even actually export McVitie's to the French with the tagline, "It's English, but it's still good." In a period of time when many will be out of jobs or continuing to rely on government subsidies to pay their salaries, are biscuits anyone's first concern? Probably not, unless they're a Viennese finger, and then I could probably be lured that way. I'll stop on Brexit here because that's a whole other can of worms that we'll inevitably come to at another time. But in just the last week, we also had the government try and fail to control the narrative on student nurses, where those who were in training at the start of the pandemic gave up their time, at the government's request no less, and stalled their career progression in order to help on the front lines during the pandemic. They subsequently found their contracts cancelled, no chance to return to tuition until next year, and received a statement from the Care Minister saying they are not deemed to be providing a service. In fact, following that proclamation last week, it was only 2 days ago, Friday the 26th, that they finally received confirmation that they would be paid until the end of their contracts. Until then, the government had stated that no further pay would be forthcoming. Child poverty, where the Prime Minister stated during Prime Minister's question time that there were 400,000 fewer families living in poverty now than there were in 2010, only for the Office of the Children's Commissioner to refer Boris Johnson to findings published in November of 2019 by the Trades Union Congress, which states that there had actually been a rise of families in poverty, and by a staggering 38%, or in actual numbers, 800,000 families. Food for children experiencing said child poverty, where Boris Johnson's aides tried to claim he had never heard of footballer Marcus Rashford's campaign to feed poor children after the government withdrew meal support for them. Then, the next day, his aides were forced to say that Boris had in fact heard of Rashford's campaign, but that he didn't agree with the cause, and that frankly 1.3 million children could effectively just starve, Sodom, and then to finally capitulate to enormous public pressure, reinstate the food vouchers and admit that Marcus Rashford was right all along, and yet to refuse to allow those vouchers to be spent in any of the 3 cheapest supermarkets in the UK, effectively rendering them utterly useless for the most in need. Racism, where, just as one example, 3 years later, the government have still done nothing in David Lammy's 35-point report to start tackling racial injustice in the UK, not to mention any of the other 600+ suggestions put forward by independent reviews since the start of 2010, and in fact seemed genuinely confused by those of black or minority ethnic backgrounds protesting throughout the country over the fact that racism is a real thing, it's here and it's happening right now. A basic understanding of history, where Tory Lord Sir Norman Tebbit stated in the Telegraph on the 22nd of this month, as part of the Statue Gate aspects of Black Lives Matter protests, that the Nazi Party was in fact left-wing and were defeated by right-wing Britain. This sudden resurgence of a view he previously aired back on the 24th of September 2018 in the same paper is published to in some way make it okay that those who were protecting Churchill's statue were photographed giving Nazi salutes. Oh, and for the record, Sir Norman Tebbit has stated categorically that he considers himself to be genuinely further right-wing than Hitler. Trade, where Boris Johnson's aforementioned announced Tim Tam sham as part of the Great New Zealand trade deal, only for the rest of his government to state almost immediately that it had close to zero value to the UK. New Zealand, we should note, are a net exporter of goods and require literally nothing from the UK in order to improve their existence. Boris's speech on Antipodean trade also included the excellent export of boomerangs to Australia. Surely, of all of the nations in the world, the one place that doesn't need to be sent boomerangs made in the old colonial homeland is the subjugated territory that has the actual indigenous population who invented the damn things in the first place. All of this, at last, brings us to my personal favourite thing they failed to control this week, the Tory party MPs themselves, where actual quotes from actual serving members of the party were made public that revealed confidence in their own PM and party leader to be so bad that, quote, if we were in normal times, you would be hearing talk by now about removing the Prime Minister. Here's some of the other hits from that amazing reveal. Boris may have to go. There's a feeling that the basic level of competence isn't there at number 10. Gavin Williamson deserves to be sacked, and the number 10 operation is totally dysfunctional. The cabinet are nodding dogs. No one seriously thinks that this cabinet is the first 11, a football or soccer reference for those of you from across the pond, and surely the best of all, the public may conclude that we are a useless shower of incompetents who were asleep at the wheel. That is from inside the party. That's their own view of themselves. That is the scene that they are now looking at in the mirror that they are holding up. And that all only took us up to Prime Minister's question time on Wednesday, the 24th of June, when Mr Johnson accused leader of the Labour Party, human rights lawyer and former head of the Crown Prosecution Service, Sir Keir Starmer, of using misleading figures when making his argument about failed contact tracing under the new scheme. The problem there? Sir Keir was able to immediately rebuff the Prime Minister with the embarrassing fact that those figures were from the government's own briefing within the preceding week. Before we temporarily move away from the Conservative Party to the other selection of total omnishambles that have occurred so far this week, let us spare a thought for haunted Victorian ventriloquist doll, European business owner and sworn enemy of people with regular person names, Jacob Rees-Mogg. This week, leader of the Commons and MP for North East Somerset, Rees-Mogg, tabled a motion that would have allowed MPs to debate any complaints brought against them through the new independent panel set up to prevent the bullying of staffers by MPs. The idea here was clearly to make it so excruciatingly unpleasant an experience for those complaining of MP harassment and bullying that no one would ever want to bring it forward. This by a man who took office and issued an immediate imperial edict insisting non-titled males must be referred to as Esquire, that two spaces must always follow a period in any typed item, and that the metric system, an official unit of measure in the United Kingdom, was banned on all documentation submitted to him by his staff. I can't even bring myself to try and find the joke here. This smarmy, self-aggrandising serpent wanted to ensure that victim shaming became de rigueur in Parliament, and that is simply revolting. What's worse, far worse, is that he only lost by 5 votes. The fact that our lawmakers think it's acceptable to remove en masse the measures designed to prevent abuse of power is harrowing in the extreme. To be fair, on the other side of the aisle, things aren't all sunshine, lollipops and rainbows for the Labour Party's recently elected leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Some of you may remember the general election the United Kingdom held some, 8,000 years ago it seems, back in 2019, and the fact that the Labour Party, then led by the allotment-loving Jeremy Corbyn, seen here worrying a young woman with his enormous marrow, were handed a truly crippling defeat by Boris Johnson as he claimed an 80-seat majority in the Houses of Parliament. A significant part of that defeat has been attributed to the seeming absence of any actual standpoint on Brexit by Jeremy Corbyn himself, a perfectly reasonable argument. I went back recently to look at the Labour manifesto again to try and work out what the actual party line was on Brexit for the 2019 election, and I think that I have finally cracked it. Vagueness. A marshland of non-answers as far as the eye can see. A clearly winning stance. The other major issue that was heavily attributed to his leadership-ending defeat was the enormous anti-Semitism row that the party became embroiled in. I think we can all agree at this point that racism is bad. It's clearly and obviously wrong and has no place in civilised living. The problem Labour had at the time is that the sentence I literally just said then about racism being bad is significantly stronger as a stance than the party leadership took in the immediate aftermath of the allegations. As a result, they left themselves wide open to the frankly masterful spin that is the Conservative party forte during election season. By the time the ballots were due to be cast in December, it wouldn't have mattered whatever Corbyn did. He could have appeared on television wearing a yarmulke to celebrate the start of Hanukkah, and he still would have been viewed as an anti-Semite sympathiser. Now, how does this affect human rights lawyer Sir Keir Starmer in the current news cycle? Well, in order to ensure that he is seen as a clean break from the lack of decisiveness on the subject shown by his predecessor, Sir Keir has started his time as party leader by stating unequivocally that there were no second chances on racism within the party. Then, on Thursday, Shadow Education Secretary Rebecca Long-Bailey, who lost the race to be party leader earlier this year, retweeted an interview with actor Maxine Peake, in which Miss Peake commented on the abhorrent killing of George Floyd by American police, saying it was done using a technique learnt from seminars with Israeli secret services. Considering Rebecca Long-Bailey was a senior figure in the Corbyn era, one has to assume that she has at least a passing familiarity with the Labour Party's previous accusations of anti-Semitism and the kind of issues that they have the potential to cause, let alone when it comes to something that can be so easily misinterpreted by those willing to do so. Supposedly, Sir Keir did actually renege on his 0 second chances policy in this instance and gave her the opportunity to take the tweet down, which we can clearly see from the subsequent outcome that Miss Long-Bailey refused to do, nicely demonstrating the high level of common sense and political awareness that made her such a formidable candidate for party leader earlier this year. Of more interest is the fact that Miss Peake herself did, in fact, walk back the statements from the interview, whilst Miss Long-Bailey continued to stand by her tweet. To further compound these issues, the sacking of Rebecca Long-Bailey, totally understandable as that actually might be as an action in the current circumstances, gives the Labour Party as a whole the kind of flimsy excuse that is all they need to descend lemming-like straight off a cliff into the infighting that they seem to consistently prefer to being an electable government in waiting. Sir Keir Starmer left watching, bemused, like a world-weary mother to a group of children who would rather raise the playground to ashes than see any of their cohorts enjoy time on the swings. Who knows? Perhaps one day Labour will end the absurd willy-waving over who is and who isn't left-wing enough to represent the party, unite behind their current seemingly competent leader, accept that the move further to the left comes only from a position of power once elected rather than from opposition, and get themselves, dear God if only, someone in the party who understands that spin is not simply a cycle on a washing machine. I won't be holding my breath. In other news this week, Jet2.com became the latest airline to announce plans to cut staff due to the continuing COVID-19 disruptions. The airline is looking to cut up to 482 frontline staff from its operation, consisting of 102 pilots and 380 cabin crew, owing to low booking numbers that this season has caused, of course, because of the coronavirus. This after we pointed out at the top of the show that the government has told us everything is peachy and we can all return to normal. Oh, except that there's now a 14-day quarantine that's been put in because of the science. Look, can you see where we've been forced to go round in a loop here? Despite trying to move away, we are inevitably dragged back time after time to the problems of the current leadership in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. After a while, it starts to feel like a helter-skelter that never ends. It's an Ouroboros that isn't eating its own tail, but rather gleefully chowing down on its own shit. A circular human centipede, if you will. By putting into place a policy like this at this time, the government has effectively taken a bazooka to what was left of the travel industry and ensured that it really finally died. No human being in their right mind is going to book an expensive overseas holiday when there's even the remotest possibility of having to spend 2 weeks in quarantine afterwards. The real kicker of all of this, it doesn't apply to everybody, effectively rendering it useless. If one can prove that the reason for travel is to conduct business that couldn't otherwise be carried out except face-to-face, then one is exempt from the requirements to isolate. In fact, the list of those exempt is genuinely huge. Please, go and look for yourselves. It starts fairly high and mighty at dignitaries and those engaged in trade with the UK, but by the end it's just saying, yeah, fruit pickers, just let them all in. Not that tighter restrictions on the quarantine would really have made much significant difference anymore anyway. On Wednesday and Thursday of this week, the UK saw some of the hottest temperatures of the year so far, with crystal blue skies across almost the entirety of the country, nicely coinciding with the government's announcement that the science showed social distancing could successfully be reduced to 1 metre going forwards. The fact that the actual scientific research published this week showed reduction of social distancing by 50% to 1 metre, increased risk of transmission by 100%, being a totally ignorable roadblock in Boris Johnson's plans to get the country back on track. What resulted was something that obviously no one could have predicted. Thousands upon thousands of Britons flocked to the beaches to enjoy the soaring temperatures and the sunshine. So many, in fact, that a major incident was declared in many of the coastal regions. White Britons are, by and large, a pasty lot. I certainly am. We aren't good with sunshine at the best of times. Even with that in mind, many see the sun as something to be directly challenged, to arrogantly stand outside, bare-chested, devoid of sunscreen, defiantly guzzling a beer, shouting, "Burn me, you prick!" Obviously, in a direct battle between Jeff from Cheshire and a celestial body weighing 333,000 times the mass of our planet, there can only ever be one winner. Jeff is left crisped, an iridescent red glow stick, unable to sit on leather chairs for 2 weeks for fear of leaving large sections of his red back behind. Clearly, Jeff and the thousands like him may suffer heat stroke in these conditions, potentially severe enough to require medical attention. You know what there aren't a large number of around in the UK at the moment? Medical professionals with very little to do. They are oddly engaged with other priorities. Jeff and co probably like to go swimming too, especially after their 4th or 5th beer. And you know what else there aren't a large number of around in the grounds of the UK at the moment? Lifeguards. The RNLI had to halt the training of its 1,600 new and returning lifeguards as part of the coronavirus pandemic, and it still hasn't been able to resume it. So at present, the lifeguard huts of Britain's beaches are woefully understaffed, if they're open at all. It's almost as though the government didn't register that many thousands of people in the UK have been stuck inside for almost 4 months, that many of them don't have access to gardens due to the overcrowding of British cities caused by a total breakdown of national town planning legislation, and that those who don't have gardens were told during the earlier heat wave this year that they were strictly forbidden to spend time outside in public places for longer than an hour a day. It's almost as though the government didn't think that making the transition from full-fledged lockdown to normal operation as vague as humanly possible would result in desperate people interpreting the situation to their own benefit. Jeff and his other sunburnt friends out there this week are obviously idiots. No question. However, we all knew that both the idiots and the desperate who've been trapped in oven-like flats for months existed. It's not as though they've been breeding in quarantine and have suddenly multiplied in number like amoeba. They haven't had the chance. They were here all along and we knew about them. The government knew about them. To suddenly optimistically dictate that personal common sense should be the guiding light going forwards when 2 of your citizens flew literally halfway across the world and reintroduced coronavirus to one of the only countries globally to have got down to a 0 reinfection rate is at best foolhardy and at worst just plain fucking dumb. In addition to the beach debacle, the return of sport nationally has been the other great indicator that the situation might have needed handling using a slightly more refined approach. Liverpool Football Club engaged in social distancing for their stands, but after they secured the Premiership trophy on Thursday for the first time in 30 years, the grounds were immediately overrun by thousands of people desperate to share this momentous occasion. These crowds stayed there for hours, partying deep into the night. Just like on the sun-drenched beaches during the preceding day, people packed together in ever tighter spaces to ensure that the virus had the best opportunity to really get hold again. Clearly, these crowds are actually environmental conservationists. Having heard the report from CNN this week that the 6th mass extinction is gaining pace faster than expected, they obviously took a joint decision to ensure that the human race is removed as fast as possible, so as to stop that from happening. Speaking of football, some Premiership clubs went to great lengths to ensure that the stadium still had some atmosphere, despite there being absolutely no one there due to the social distancing requirements. Leeds United, as a perfect example, offered fans the chance to get their face put onto a cardboard cutout in the stands for £25. Many fans took advantage of this, and they just wanted to obviously ensure that they were there at least in fuzzy resolution to support their team. Some enterprising young individual decided, however, that this was the perfect opportunity for some top-level bantsmate. they duly paid their money and then successfully submitted the grinning visage of deceased Al-Qaeda frontman Osama bin Laden. The best bit about this is that no one caught it until it made national news. Who knows how many pairs of hands that passed through to get into the stands, but at the bare minimum, someone printed it, someone cut it out, someone placed it on a seat. None of them did anything. Perhaps this is going to spark a trend. Will we see Stalin in the stands of the British Grand Prix? Is Pol Pot going to be revealed as a major cricket fan come the summer test matches? Is Goebbels going to put in an appearance at the Ryder Cup? Who knows? It wouldn't be the strangest thing to happen so far this year. No, that trend goes to TikTok's Pee Your Pants challenge from back in April, where a group of people who must remember are either already in or about to join the jobs market voluntarily stared barefaced into a camera and, while sober, deliberately lost control of their bladder. In comparison to that, having sporting fixtures championing the faces of deceased murderous extremists starts to seem almost mundane. This, at last, brings us to tonight's main topic, a run of events that are shaping up to have some striking undertones of 2006-2007's Cash for Honours scandal. For those of you who weren't aware of the, to give it one of its many other names, Loans for Lordships furore of 13 years ago, here's a quick recap. A loophole in electoral law in the UK means that whilst donations made to a political party, no matter how small, have to be made a matter of public record, loans made to that same party at commercial interest rates do not. This resulted in the Labour Party of the day being accused of taking money on loan so as to deliberately avoid the scrutiny in exchange for submitting those who had given them money for peerages. It finally fizzled out in July of 2007. When the Crown Prosecution Service stated that they would not pursue charges because they couldn't find any direct evidence that the peerages had been agreed to prior to receiving the loans. This, despite the fact that any Venn diagram one would care to draw for those who loaned money and those who were offered peerages starts to have an alarmingly obvious overlap. That's all well and good, but it is, of course, the distant past. How does it affect us now? Well, the simple answer is that it was the last time that conflict of interest was really front and centre in UK politics on a national scale. That started to change in the last couple of weeks, however, as we'll show you now. To kick this section off, please give a warm welcome back to the stage our previous sideshow attraction, the insufferably smug Debbie McGee, who, we mentioned earlier, was all too willing to sacrifice himself upon the member of Johnson. Alter of Johnson. He has had, since the World Health Organization first suggested the bold notion of using modern technology in the form of a track and trace app back in the dim distant March of March this year, 3 months to get ahead of the project. To date, Mr. Hancock, who has absolutely zero training in IT or app development, has routed £11.8 million of UK taxpayer money into trying to create a world-beating product. This app was so world-beating that it was publicly derided as 100% not going to work by IT giants Apple and Alphabet, the Google parent company. Furthermore, 11.8 million is stated by industry leaders as being 3 times the average budget for any track and trace app worldwide. That's almost as outrageous as the level of overcharging that is the current price of Freddos this day. You see, Cadbury, I see you. I see you, they aren't worth 25 pence. That money continued to be paid out to the NHS even after experts stated categorically that the app was not fit for purpose. Who was in charge of this overweight behemoth of an app as it lumbered off with taxpayer money in exchange for the digital equivalent of a dog crapping on the floor and then spreading it around with your Roomba? Conservative peer Dido Harding, seen here with her husband, Tory MP John Penrose. Now, I'm not saying that this seems ominously incestuous of the Conservatives, but if Matt Hancock's future press statements suddenly descend into banjo duels, I'm certainly not going to be overly surprised. Those who were paying attention will have seen that horse racing was first out of the gates for the return of sport at the start of this month, and although I'm not really sorry, that pun was the lowest hanging fruit available and I just couldn't resist it. I'm only the tiniest bit ashamed. Regardless, why are we talking about horse racing when but seconds ago we were talking about the morally grey mutual gratification circle jerk of our current ruling class? Well, everyone's favourite magician's assistant is MP for Newmarket, home of one of the UK's largest and most popular horse races. He has received an estimated £100,000 in donation from senior horse racing officials as part of his campaign fundraising. It goes further. He has been accused of operating in the interests of those involved in horse racing over and above his own constituents, and it wasn't even subtle. During his time in office, Matt Hancock has attempted to block the building of new homes within his constituency because they would have exceptional negative economic impact on local business. There is only one local business of major note in Newmarket, and that is the racecourse. Who, you might ask, is on the Jockey Club board that's been providing Mr. Hancock with his funding and so obviously influencing his standing on policy? Amongst others, waster of taxpayer money, Dido Harding, who, as we've already established, is herself a Tory peer, wife of a sitting Tory MP and receiver of almost £12 million of government funding thanks to Mr. Hancock. Another notable member was the sadly recently deceased Rose Patterson, reported dead but 3 days ago. Chairman of Aintree Racecourse, where UK racing's premier race takes place, the Grand National, she was the wife of Tory MP for North Shropshire, Owen Paterson. But wait, there is more. Owen Paterson MP receives a reported £100,000 a year to act as an advisor for Randox Health, a Northern Ireland-based company that specialises in health checks to establish your health baseline and track your changes over time. Before I go on, I should point out that whilst that tagline does sound like the nonsensical waffle of a B-grade used car salesman, they are a legitimate laboratory who produce genuinely well-regarded products for the medical industry throughout the world. But why is Randox Health getting a mention here at all? Well, in addition to paying sitting MP Owen Paterson a six-figure salary, they are the primary sponsor of his now sadly deceased Jockey Club wife's gold standard event, the Grand National, and to top it off they were awarded a £133 million contract for coronavirus testing kits by, you guessed it, Matt Hancock's Department for Health and Social Care. This was done through a newly introduced special measures scheme in such a way as to avoid all of the messy, antiquated legal requirement for public tender of government contracts. As a result, not one single other company had the chance to apply. Let me quickly summarise that all with a good pop culture reference, if you'll allow me. It's the equivalent of Jaime Lannister paying Cersei for sex, then her giving him a disability allowance for the loss of his arm, whilst together they pay Tyrion to babysit Joffrey using the taxes collected by Joffrey as king, all under the recommendation of Daddy Tywin, who they're paying as a consultant using their own inheritance. That's right. Regardless of whether any actual impropriety has taken place, from the outside, this all is mad enough to make even House Lannister look like they half-assed being incestuous and self-serving. Hang on though, that only mostly brings us up to the early parts of June. Why has the significance of these in-dealings continued to escalate this week? To answer that, we're forced to introduce a new player to the Conservative Party magic show. To further torture this metaphor that I've been brutalising all night, we'll call him the volunteer from the audience. You know the one, the guy who's so obviously a plant for the mechanics of the show that it makes your eyes roll back in your head so far that you can study your own brain the moment he's called to the stage. Yet somehow he's able to answer the question, have we ever met before, with a straight face. Further awkward probing questions by our magician of our supposedly random audience member reveal his name to be Robert Jenrick, MP for Newark, and his job to be Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. Robert is 38 years old, hails from Wolverhampton, has a law degree from St John's College and is family friends with foreign billionaires who have direct business in sectors that he's had oversight of. His hobbies include using his influence to force through planning approval on one of his multiple homes, despite previously having had the application rejected twice, allegedly, and pushing through planning applications for his pornographer friends in order to save them £40 million plus in community levies that would have gone to one of the poorest areas in London. Robert claims to know nothing of the upcoming magic trick and will duly gasp appreciatively along with the rest of the audience at the final reveal. Surely I'm joking. Sadly, I must state I am not. Here's young Rob Jenrick's running tally broken down into a fair bit more detail, and I'll try and do it as best as I can chronologically and without boring you to death. In October of 2013, just a few short weeks before his selection as Conservative candidate for Newark, Jenrick and his wife Mikhail Berkner purchase a 5-bedroom townhouse in a London conservation area. Almost immediately, the couple submit a planning application in Mr Jenrick's name to turn their first floor terrace into an extra room as part of a staggering £830,000 renovation to the property. The application was rightly refused, and on the basis that it would damage the character and appearance of the building and conservation area. Mr Jenrick applies again soon after to get the application put through and is again denied by the planning officer on the same grounds. Then, 2 months after being elected as Conservative MP for Newark, Clan Jenrick submit their application once more, but this time under the name of the lady of the house, Mr Mikhail Berkner. That's not me saying it wrong, that's them submitting it bafflingly incorrectly. Clearly, the couple are enormous fans of the sitcom Friends and wish to pay homage to the Miss Chenandler Bong scene. One would think that, as nothing else had changed except the name of the applicant, that this application would meet a swift, withering death at the hands of the planning officer once more, and it should have. The planning officer denied it for the 3rd time. That wasn't to be the end, however. This time, Tory councillor and close neighbour of the family, Steve Summers, intervened and requested that the application be referred to a higher committee to make a decision. This kind of move, a sitting councillor requesting a planning committee review an application, is usually used when the public are the ones who have complained about a planning proposal. One of the primary ideas behind it, as an option, is to ensure that sensible planning officer recommended construction isn't waylaid by NIMBYism or not in my backyard arguments from members of the public. You know the type, I'm sure you do, the I've got nothing against building a new road, just not in my backyard. Or I've got nothing against feeding the homeless, just not in my backyard. Or I've got nothing against you doing insert literally any common sense thing here, just not in my backyard. One industry insider I spoke with told me that having a personal project such as this go to planning committee without any other public interest at stake is extremely unusual. The decision they took to overturn the recommendation of the council's own planning officer in favour of Mr Jenrick was, according to the same industry insider, almost unheard of. All 3 of the Westminster Council Planning Committee members who approved this application were themselves Conservative Party members. The 4th member of the committee, Labour councillor Ruth Bush, who voted against the proposal, backed up our industry insider when she described the whole process as strange and unusual. This is just the first bit on our list, but I've got to tell you, it's already got my banjo senses tingling off in the distance. Diddling ding 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 ding. Next we come to beleaguered potash mining company Sirius Minerals. I cannot tell you how much I wish they had a spin-off brand, but I am sorry to say you will not be seeing adverts for Sirius Minerals, energy drinks that rock, anytime soon. Nothing so exciting. US-based Sirius Minerals was founded in 2003 as a North Dakota potash mining company that in 2017 started development of the Woodsmith mine in North Yorkshire, UK. You know potash mining, it's exciting stuff, a real conversation starter. Sirius Minerals have had a rocky, again, I'm not sorry for that easy pun, time in the UK, and as of the 4th of March 2020, their shareholders have voted to accept a low-ball offer by Anglo American of $400 million for the whole operation. However, between 2017 and 2019, when they declared potential insolvency, they were in direct competition for a mining project against foreign billionaire Edan Ophir's loss-making UK-based company, Cleveland Potash. Who should Sirius Minerals submit a request for financial support to during that time in order to get their bid successfully off the ground? Well, the UK government, of course, but more specifically, the UK Treasury. In 2017, when the request was submitted, the contact for financing of this project within the UK government was none other than Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, wee Bobby Jenrick. That shouldn't feel like a big reveal. I shouldn't feel like I've just pulled back the curtain to discover that the volunteer who's been sawn in half is actually two people in separate boxes. Sorry, that tortured magician reference has reared its head again. From your point of view, it may not seem like a big reveal yet anyway, but then I do know what's coming next. See, back in September of 2019, Sirius Minerals revealed that not receiving the support of the UK Treasury on their application was the major factor that left the company on the brink of financial collapse. And that is interesting because on the 21st of March 2018, Edan Ophir had a meeting with, would you believe it, MP Robert Jenrick. It gets better, honestly. Here we go. It turns out that Mr. Jenrick was obliged to disclose this meeting to government officials because, as revealed last Friday 26th of June by a spokesperson for the MP, Edan Ophir is a family friend of the Jenricks. As a result of this obvious potential for conflict of interest, Mr. Jenrick was instructed to recuse himself from the decision-making process surrounding Sirius Minerals applications. Accounts indicate that he did indeed follow this advice. However, there's no indication as to when he finally did recuse himself, and more importantly, Mr. Jenrick retained oversight of the project for a further 6 months before leaving his position at the Treasury. That's like taking an almighty shit on your own carpet, your wife telling you that you need to clean the carpet, agreeing with her about cleaning the carpet, and then deliberately leaving it to fester for 180 days, only for your wife to finally give in, throw out the carpet, only for you to continue to insist that it's a curious case of some phantom shitter coming into your house and doing it on the floor. The decision to finally reject Sirius Minerals' financial aid request wasn't taken by Mr. Jenrick, in fairness, although one suspects he will have had some influence, even if only tentatively, over proceedings during the time he retained oversight of the application. It was, instead, taken by now Secretary of State for International Trade, Liz Truss MP. Astonishingly, there's one more twist here on this part. Mr. Ophir's company, Quantum Pacific UK, have only ever made one donation to the Conservative Party, and it was for £10,000 around the time of the Sirius Minerals decision. Then, this week, things got really interesting as 5 years of events came to a head. This is former media mogul turned property developer Richard Desmond. He made his fortune initially as the provider of pre-internet, top-shelf softcore publications such as Asian Babes and Horny Housewives. Later, he diversified into, amongst other publications, occasional providers of news and much lauded chip shop wrappers, the Daily Express and the Daily Star. For a while, he also owned Channel 5, as well as the True to Form, Television X and the Red Hot channel. Mr. Desmond's primary interest these days features fewer ladies with their nipples out and is largely more property-based. It's through these property ventures, that he blunders into our show. One of the areas he has been looking to develop since 2015 is the West Ferry print works on the Isle of Dogs. Whilst it sits in the shadow of the financial district that is the City of London, the capital's money-making heart, the Isle of Dogs and neighbouring Tower Hamlets are, on the whole, not wealthy areas. Banking hub Canary Wharf is in fact part of the Tower Hamlets borough, which means that whilst it has the third highest economic output of any local authority area in the whole of the UK, it is also considered the 10th most deprived local authority overall in England and ranks first on the same shortlist in terms of child poverty. This is not a wealthy area, quite the opposite in fact, and perhaps not then the most obvious choice for a development with an estimated average price per home of £650,000. As a result, at least in part of this massive disparity between resident financial status and the estimated cost of these new builds, Tower Hamlets Council insisted that the originally submitted plan for 744 homes should include 36% affordable housing. Northern and Shell Investments, Mr Desmond's company, offered 11%, and rather understandably, we suddenly had a good old-fashioned Mexican standoff in London's West End. Except, in London, it's not a Mexican standoff. In London, there's a convenient plot device to move us out of this Mexican standoff. In London, we have our all-too-convenient and contrived Deus Ex Machina, because in London, the Mayor's office can take over the decision from the council if the Mayor believes there is a sound planning reason to do so. London's Mayor at that point in time was, of course, our current headline magician, Boris Johnson, although even by then it had become glaringly obvious that Labour's Sadiq Khan was favourite to replace him when his term came to an end. Northern and Shell are reported to have invited Mayor Johnson to step in, and like offering your Shih Tzu a new squeaky toy, he simply couldn't resist. Johnson rode roughshod over Tower Hamlets Council objections and conveniently passed the application in the nick of time just before leaving office. Fast forward to 2018. Northern and Shell submit a new application, almost doubling the total number of houses, dramatically raising the height of the buildings to 43 stories and initially offering a council-appeasing 35% affordable housing, all of which appeared to be going through the planning process as one would expect. Now, we can't say for sure why Mr Desmond's company felt that the normal planning process was failing them, nor exactly why they would need for the second time to call in outside influence, but for some reason, Northern and Shell took that opportunity to once again call in the bigger guns. Except this time, they bypassed the new left-wing London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and request instead the intervention of the Secretary of State. This is as high as a planning decision can be pushed in the United Kingdom. We've now gone all the way to the tippy top, the very peak where we find Britain's temple of planning, the home of the absolute truth from which all developmental legislation is derived, the ornate throne, iron in colour, unparalleled in majesty, forged from the swords of those defeated at planning tribunal, from where all proclamations regarding the planning law are made. On that throne, that hallowed, towering seat of planning power, rests Robert Jenrick. Anyone who's been paying attention so far will see, unsurprisingly, that Jenrick's involvement in this East End property pickle might cause it to turn from business section political manoeuvring to national front page clusterfuck. Thing is though, everything you've already been thinking, all the juicy little details that you've just joined together in your head, it is better than that, and by miles. The State Department for Housing has its own planning inspectors, obviously, and they reportedly directed to the Secretary of State that in this instance they recommended against approving the plan. Let me say that once more. The experts specifically qualified in this exact field recommended to the minister, who is temporarily in charge of them and has no training or relevant experience whatsoever, that this plan specifically did not meet the required threshold to be approved. They even highlight that amongst many other reasons, it specifically didn't meet its requirement on affordable housing, where the percentage being offered had suddenly and with no explanation miraculously dropped from 35% to 21%. Mr Jenrick's decision was also rushed through specifically to ensure that it beat a looming deadline. That deadline was the impending change in community infrastructure levies that Tower Hamlets were introducing on the 15th of January this year, which would have cost Northern and Shell an extra estimated £40 million. That levy is specifically used by councils to improve infrastructure and facilities for those in the local area, whenever new developments are erected. Mr Jenrick rushed to beat that deadline right down to the wire by one solitary day to ensure that Labour-led Tower Hamlets Council didn't receive that extra money. He made special request of his staff to ensure that it was passed in time to prevent a vulnerable community from receiving extra funding. What's more, we know from other public text messages and emails that this was done expressly at the request of Mr Desmond himself, and we know that from at least one of these text messages sent to MP Jenrick that Desmond took some measure of glee in doing it. Here's the one I mean. We appreciate the speed, as we don't want to give Marxists a load of dough for nothing. Mr Desmond considers the essential financial support of communities in which he's developing property to be nothing. Oh, schools for local children? That's nothing. Improving the roads so they can cope with the increased population? Don't care about that. Community areas, including shops and doctors' surgeries? Seems pretty extra if you ask me. Then, in echoes of the situation we talked about with Mr Ofer earlier, following the awarding of planning permission for his new development, Mr Desmond reportedly made a personal donation to the Conservative Party on the 29th of January this year to the tune of £12,000. We know all this happened. It's now a matter of public record that it happened, because on Wednesday of this week, the government issued 129 pages of evidence outlining that it happened in the wake of Robert Jenrick's own admission that the decision he took regarding the application was unlawful. In spite of all this, the pandering to a lobbyist, the rushed acceptance of a plan that didn't meet requirements, the now overturned unlawful action of a sitting MP, the suspicious timing of a large donation to the party, and the huge public outcry that has understandably arisen, Robert Jenrick remains Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government at time of recording. Not only that, but Boris Johnson stated to the House that he now considers the matter closed, effectively offering his full support to a minister unavoidably embroiled in scandal. Now, obviously alone, none of these things are individually excessively damning, certainly equalled by the actions of others in both government and opposition. It is entirely possible, and those concerned would certainly argue definite, that with the exception of the one unquestionably illegal activity outlined tonight, no breach of public interest has taken place. However, when looked at together, they sure do start to have all the hallmarks of a pattern. After all, if it looks, swims and quacks like politicians abusing their power, then maybe, just maybe, it's a duck. Until next week, I'm Ben Somerville. Good night.